by the Reno area. As I call her Aunt Patty. That's all I've ever known to call her. She's known me since I was in the womb, and she's part of the group that I often in Reno. Uh, and she referred to the group in that way. She's an integral, not only of my own life, through her influence on me, and I'm sure she has even more, directly through her direct influence on especially my mother and grandmother. So I'm extremely thankful for Aunt Patty. Um, and she's not even here for me. She's here to spend time with my grandma. I think they're antediluvian. Um, One of them was the other swimmer. I'll let you do the guesswork, but um, start is reality. Was for that lesson, but take heart. Most of the people who don't remember it very well. It was on them. It's just the passage of consuming a lot. Yeah, the thing that I talked about primarily was our need to long to need for a zealous and deep love per creator. Marveling, and hopefully it seems marvelous to you, is by pondering and hopeful and ponderous psalmists, several of them, a couple in particular, um, were ecstatic, were emphatic, were enthusiastic, outright zealous about the law of the Lord. That's strange to me because I know that David and Psalms, I'm inclined to believe that it was David who wrote the 119th Psalm, but I think we're pretty about the law. Its sweetness. 119th Psalm is 170 some above God, and that's so strange to me because he's talking about the law of Moses. Leviticus this week, right? You just keep going back to, yes, it's your favorite. You're laughing. The way the psalmist did about the 5 books of the Bible, the law of Moses, you don't feel that excited, that up at night is longing for and loving and meditating on the law? Yep, me neither, honestly, just in case you were growing suspicious. Me neither. But the psalmists were really into that. Why? Well, I don't think, I think it was because the but I don't, because remember, you also makes you unclean. Things that just happen normally, regularly, cyclically. make you unclean. Sin definitely makes you unclean, but there's plenty of things that are not sin that are even good and make you unclean. And this is the song that could never take away sin. Only being able to be God in the once a year by one man going into one room to sprinkle blood for you and everyone else. There are beautiful things that we can think about because of those things being a foreshadow of Christ, but those things in and of themselves aren't. The picture of your uncleanness isn't beautiful. The picture of the fact that you can be made clean is something more like beautiful, but I don't think that's the beauty that kept to the law. The beauty of the law seems to me, and because it's what the psalmists say, to be because it reveals the mind and character and nature and the beauty of God, the lawgiver. The law wasn't beautiful, but it was like a window through which you could see this beautiful, bright glory on the other side. It's a frosted window. Maybe it's even a stained glass window. But you draw near to it, not just to, and you examine every shape and every color and every shape. It's just where you have to look to see, to get as close as you can to that beauty. I think that's why they loved of God. Of course, so in some ways a veil, or at least they had a veil over their eyes as they read it, because they couldn't actually approach the glory of God. And Paul, in one of his letters to the Corinthian saints, says that veil great many people when they encounter the law. And what I want you to think about is, I think about it's obsolete. A schoolmaster that brought to the beauty of God, and that it is not how we come to God. Better blood with bring sacrifice for all. And so in that gratitude, we ought to desire to obey God. I think a lot of us, if not all of us, are here out of some desire to obey God. But I want to talk to you this morning for obedience. I want to talk to you this morning about the kind of people that we are, the reason, the motivation we ought to have in our obedience to God, and what's going on before. And of course, this is just ones, 4 or 5 sermons that Moses is preaching to the Israelites before they go into Canaan without him. And he's imploring, he's begging them to remain devoted to their deliverer who brought them out of Egypt. And he's reminding them of how they got to where they are, and so the kind of people they ought to be when they go in. And so here he's reminding them of when they first came to Horeb, Sinai's mountain. And here, definitely in Exodus, but also in, I think of Hebrews 12, we have these comparisons, but we have these descriptions of what it was like to come to that mountain. And we had beginning of the text that they heard the voice out of the while the mountain was fire. And you heard in verse 24, he says, "The Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire." Where we talk about, we read it being talked about, verse 22, "Out of the midst of the fire, the cloud and the thick darkness with a loud voice." And in other places, we have that the mountain was shaking. It was smoking, not just cloudy, but it was clouded and it was smoking. And there was fire, there was lightning and peals of thunder. It was terrifying. They came to this mountain and around this mountain and were greatly afraid already. And then they hear the voice of God. And it's God's raw, unfiltered voice that declares to them, that breathes to them the 10 Commandments. And then in this chapter, we have it in Exodus as well, but response to Moses that we're good. We're done with this. We still live, but we heard the voice of God. No flesh has done that and still lived. We're gonna quit while we're ahead. You go up the mountain for us. And we might interpret that as cowardice if we didn't keep reading, right? But I made sure that Ian kept all the way through verse 29. Here it says, they were right in all. That was the correct response, was to be terribly, deathly afraid of the God who spoke to them from the They were right. He even says, "Oh, that my people had this heart always to fear me and keep my commandments." And in talking about that first, that's what precedes keeping his commandments, obedience. It's preceded by the talk to you, because fear kinds of contingent. It's contingent on whether it's a fully accomplished fear or partial. I'll explain. There's the kind of obedience that we offer out of fear of bad consequences. You have had times when you have done what you were expected to do, commanded to do, instructed to do, expected. Probably said that one twice. You've done whatever you should so that bad things don't happen to you, so that you don't get parents or with your boss, get looked down, don't get questioned in your maturity or authority, so that you don't get whatever bad thing. And I'm sure that I'm probably not the only who has at times in my life only obeyed God out of fear me and keep commandments. The fear of consequence is incomplete. Show you. Their response, where they were right, they said, "This day we have seen God speak with man." That's why they were afraid. But the rest of the sentence is, "and man still live." And then they begin a little bit after that. Why should we die? For the will consume us if we hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore. We hear the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of fire as we lived. Their unbridled fear was directed because the one that they rightly feared preserved them. More than preserved, more than the fact that he didn't, out of the midst of the fire, consume them with fire. He delivered them out of bondage, and is taking great pains, has long suffered these 40 years of wilderness by this point, to bring them to this mountain and to bring them to this point, this precipice before going into Canaan, the land that he promised and would faithfully give them. We have to know Jesus to when he's sending out the disciples as sheep in the fields. Fear the one who can only destroy your body, soul, of bad things ought to be a significant motivator for us. See, we have another place where an apostle says, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men. Fear really seems to be a part of it, but I have to warn you against incomplete fear. I have to caution against it, because history is rife with examples of people keeping out of fear of consequences, fear of punishment, and God. The most plain find it in Scripture is in Isaiah chapter 1. If you want to turn there. Under the old law should emphasize all that they're actively been replaced with the law of Christ. They don't have the new covenant that would be written on their hearts. The fulfillment of hope in the coming or in the they don't have that. And yet, in verse 11, pick up Isaiah chapter. The Lord said to me, multitude of your sacrifices. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling? And says, bring no more vain offerings. Your incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations, for iniquity and solemn assembly, your new moons and your appointed feasts, my hands I will blood. It's reminiscent of the passage that writes, people honor me with their lips, far from me. We're going to come back to this. The psalmist, somebody who drew near to God in deep desire and admiration, who longed for, who thirsted after God, the way that we're blessed if we also will do, had more in mind. Is that an understatement? They had much more in mind than the fear of hell. The fear of hell does not, I dare say, produce a living love of God. And I must remind you that the greatest commandments that Jesus props up and says everything hangs on this, everything points to this, is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is that you love your neighbor as yourself. Let me just do this little thought experiment with me. If your neighbor, we'll say, we won't go through the Good Samaritan exercise of who is my neighbor. Let's say the person who lives next door or closest to you comes to you in desperate need of some help. Their car broke down, you know how to fix it, but you don't want to give the time to that. You're busy or enjoying something else. They need somebody to watch their kids while they go take care of a medical emergency with a family member. They need you and they need something. You think, well, if I don't, God will be mad at me. God says that I have to do this, so I'm going to do this. Minimum, I don't know if that's your thought. You or you bring them in and you help them and you serve them, but all the time you're thinking, I could be watching the game, I could be hanging out with my own kids, I could be working, I could be I would rather be, I don't like this. Did you fulfill the command to love your neighbor? No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Because love is at least an attitude. So when we elevate that to the greatest command, and you get up, I'm sure it didn't happen this morning, and I'm sure for most on a Sunday morning, and you kind of loathe for a minute or longer the fact that you just woke up on a Sunday morning, and you think, I don't want to do this. And all the night doing all the things you need while there's storm clouds, and you just, this isn't what you don't want to. Maybe you don't like the people. Maybe you're convinced the people don't feel like going to that stinky place anymore or looking at those green walls again. Maybe you don't feel like, maybe you don't want to. I don't know what you've ever been. I know what some of mine have been. We can compare notes later. Maybe because if you don't, you're forsaking the assembly. When you show and you're just a little ball, we'll say a little ball of rage and resentment, and the only reason when King on Judgment Day and he comes to that place in the record, do you think we get to say, I showed up, didn't I? I even wore a tie. I sang. I bowed my head when they prayed. Did you love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength? You did not. And to insist to yourself or amongst yourselves that you'll get to show that good for entrance into the kingdom, you're deceiving yourselves. And you're actually falling into a trap of saying that your entrance into heaven is dependent on your works, and that you being good, you feel good, and you did so much good that God has to let you in now. for every time that I felt that way. Because that is not what God is faithful and just to forgive. It's a broken and contrite heart, not despise. I don't pick on attendance because I think that's the most pressing universal command. Really, I don't. I think it's maybe one of the ones that we most have seen in ourselves or others. Some kind of waffling over, some kind of debate about, some kind of struggle with, do I go, don't I go, I don't do. Pick any other thing that God says you ought to do. Check your attitude. Is that you, whoever your neighbor might be, did you love your neighbor? That's different, isn't it? And I'm not, what I want to be careful about is seeming to fight fear with more fear. Now, not only do you have to be afraid of God, who might strike you down the next time you step out of line, you also need to be afraid that he'll do that if you do the right thing and don't all the way mean to. Now, maybe I'm adding fear upon fear. That's not my intention. To give you the antidote, but I need you to see clearly, as clearly as you to see the so that maybe we'll see how we need to run away. The God that can and and just and blameless if he does. Didn't. He knows. I want you to just for a moment think of the most atrocious thing that you've done and remember, think the blessed fact that the God who knew before the foundation of the world that you would be in your life, instead of striking you down, you he he I am right, brightness of my image. I made, and they walk right in saying that, and he does not. He said, "This broken." Waiting, hold your feet to the fire for that judgment day so that he can punish, punish, punish. He's waiting for that day, and I'm confident that he weeps every time he says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And that he longs for that day because to some, he will get to say, "Come home, come in, enter in. I made this for you, and I made you for this. Let's be together." Fear that only thinks of the first part is incomplete. Fear that only seeks to complete and is ineffective. It will not save your soul. The love is right than awesome, full, consuming fire of a God preserved instead. I love that God. Of course, I want to run to that God. I want to dwell in his court forever. I want to learn everything about him. He is. I want him to make me more like him. I want more. Learn about him through his law. Yes, please. I'll have that. I'm skipping dinner. Thanks, Mom. I want this. How much more when we have Christ? I want to put this to you. Um, start winding down. A friend helped me come up with this analogy. Incomplete fear, immature fear, and the obedience that it seems to accompany is like, let's call it, teenage obedience. I'm sure none of the teenagers here feel this way. I'm sure nobody here felt this way when they were a teenager. I'm sure everybody is right who isn't already. I hear it's great. You've maybe become a teenager doing the dishes and hating every second of it. Mowing the lawn, hating every second of it. Cleaning their room, hating doing it. Because bad things will happen if they don't, right? Out of fear. And think about the love for the parents that is present in the teenager cleaning his room as aggressively as possible. Every book hanger in the closet is slammed onto the hanger, and then you can't get that right the first time, especially with teenage coordination. So repeatedly, and then you do have to be careful. But something or slam the as you is angry and malevolent and begrudging at best, because you're obedient because, well, you do want dinner still. But boy, you want it to be made very clear that you don't want to be doing this. And I think there's been too many times in my life when I've given to God nothing more than what we'll call obedience. I've said, fine, I'll show up, put my straighten my tie out. I don't think this has ever been the or life that I've been most comply with, but not never. And if on the off chance, spiritually, in the only way out is right. The only way to stop being a teenager is to grow, right? Because somehow when you're and going through all those high school anymore, then you only ever love obeying authority. Then you only ever love doing what you're told. You only ever love time and doing what you're supposed to, because you've grown up, right? No. Um, if you're a on and hurry up through that phase, I think that's what most have been encouraged to do. You run the thought experiment on how that's going. I instead want to implore you with our the other and to become like out of this mess. It's to empty yourself of all the maturity that you think you have, all the skills and freedom and liberty you think you ought to have. Go backwards. I want you to be like Sophia here. And not just right now when she's quiet and mostly content, seems content. I don't know. We'll see. Um, I don't want you to just be still and be quiet. Um, I want you to hunger and thirst for God, knowing that you are desperately dependent on Him to provide it. I want you to go back to a of infancy and dependent on God for everything. I want you to go back to knowing, to deeply understanding, to believing that you are helpless and dead without Him. The psalmist seems to have been in this state as often as you hear them or we read them writing about how their mattress is soaked with their tears because all night they cried out to God. What I'm saying to you is that if your service to God is only your get out of hell free card, it is not actually a get out of hell free card. Do you remember everything? His wife said, just curse God and die. Courage. Not, and I'm going to make an analogy. Not telling you that if your response to God is in fear, just to obey, comply, keep your head down so that you don't get sent to hell, just avoid detection, your end will be very similar to if you just curse God and die. Because what do we do with a teenager who's only ever rebellious and hates being under our roof? Do we say when they turn 18 or whatever your magic number is, and you say, welcome, congratulations, you can stay with me forever? That's obviously not what they want. Is that what the soul wants, who's only ever bitter and angry and resentful at a God they think will just strike them down if they step out of line, so we better just keep doing? Will it be a welcome home? Said I would give something of, and the way that the antidote comes to you, goodness of the Lord. I want to close to a few verses in. I'm going to stop. You should not, or you should come. King forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever. is the Lord and greatly to be praised. His great commend another and shall declare mighty acts on the glorious splendor of your majesty, and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak awesome, declare your greatness. They shall the fame of your abundant goodness and shall sing aloud of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all. To stop there. What are we going to declare to the generations after us? How are we going to stimulate people to a mature out of a love and sincere devotion? What is it going to be that will stir up to love and good works and not only what will it will be that we pour forth constantly his good works. Praise and tell of his praiseworthiness to every generation. You need to know that God can destroy and but he the God and restored and bound up the brokenhearted. He is the God that reaches down in great love into your life to change you, to heal you, to love you, and to how great God and how worthy to be praised. If you say that God, praise God. And deep love. Respectful gratitude. If this great God